Please go ahead and continue enjoying your lunch. But while we're eating, we're going to hear from Dr. Bruce Yandel. I believe you were properly introduced to him earlier today, and you know that Dr. Yandel is the Dean Emeritus of the College of Business and Behavioral Sciences at Clemson University and a Mercatus Adjunct Scholar. I know Dr. Yandel in a little different way. I think of him as one of our best communicators. I think of him as a star of our Capitol Hill campus course, and I think of him as one of our frequent contributors to our podcast on state and local policy. This past summer, he was a speaker in Charleston, South Carolina at a convention, and my colleague Kathleen O'Hearn and I had the privilege of going to hear Dr. Yandel, as well as some other speakers. And at our table, I was the thorn amongst the roses. I was seated between my colleague Kathleen and Dr. Yandel's wife, and for those of you who know Susan Dudley, there was a very elegant lady who looked just like Susan Dudley on the other side of me, except that she had jet black hair. Dr. Yandel got up, gave a presentation. He absolutely filled the room with his intelligence and his humor, and people enjoyed what he had to say, and they actually learned something and enjoyed it at the same time, which is a rare feat in education. The next speaker got up to speak, and he was also an economist, and we won't say who he was, but he wasn't faring nearly so well as Dr. Yandel, and I heard a gentleman behind me sort of gently snoring. And the rather elegant lady leaned over to me, and she said in a very pronounced Southern accent, "Your man should have gone second." And I said, "Well, did you not like Dr. Yandel?" And she said, "No, I thought he was excellent. He should have gone second because he was a hard act to follow." And Dr. Yandel is a hard act to follow, so I'm glad that I have the privilege of introducing him to you rather than following him. So without further ado, Dr. Bruce Yandel.
Thanks very much, and thanks for telling that story because I hadn't heard it, and but a little bit too much of a build-up. It's a pleasure and please enjoy your lunch while I'm speaking. As a classroom teacher for many, many years, I'm accustomed to people doing different things while I'm home. But when you spoke about the person who went to sleep, I had a habit, back in the days where you still had blackboards and chalk, and of course that dates me, and that's all right. When you get my age, it doesn't matter. But I had a habit of coming into the classroom about 15 minutes ahead of the class beginning, and I would outline the key points of my lecture in one of the panels of the blackboard. And have a little section at the top about the high points of the previous lecture, and down at the bottom, coming attractions. And as I would lecture, I would walk over and check things off, and it was a memory checker for me, and I was hoping it would be helpful to the students in organizing their notes. There was a young man who would come to class early. I would still be putting my outline on the board, and he sat on the front row. He would sit down, put his arm on his bed, put his head down, and go to sleep. And he would sleep until class was over. And so the next time he did that, and I was in a good enough mood, I went over and I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "Look, young man, you don't need to come to class if you're going to sleep. Why don't you stay in your dormitory room or your apartment, get some good rest, and maybe we'll get together later." And he said, "But Dr. Yandel, I can sleep so much better when you're talking." So good luck out there while you're enjoying your lunch. The title of my remarks, the handwriting is on the wall. Bootleggers and Baptists are everywhere. And I'll try to elaborate a little bit so that both of the components of that title begin to make a little bit of sense. We had in our previous speakers, our two politicians who spoke to us, both emphasized that America is ready. That maybe the planets are finally aligned. Maybe we have gotten in desperate enough straits so that we have to begin applying what I would call some common sense the things that we're trying to fix and do. And so, in that sense, if America is ready, and if the predicate that I mentioned to that statement holds, it would square with our expression in our language of the handwriting is on the wall. And of course, all of you know that that expression entered our language many, many years ago, and it's taken from that fabulous book of Daniel, the Old Testament. And the story is told about people having a great banquet, and suddenly the hand of a person shows up and begins to write on the wall. And young Daniel is made famous by reading to the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, what's been written there. And he translated and he says, "You've been weighed in the balance and found wanting," which is another way of saying your benefit cost analysis is no good. And so, in that sense, if the handwriting is on the wall, and I hope it is, in a substantive sense, so that we might move forward. But I want to talk to you about another kind of handwriting on the wall, and maybe enlist you as my research assistants just for a few minutes. I've had an interest for many, many years in another kind of handwriting on the wall, what people commonly call graffiti. Things that get written on bathroom walls and desktops and on signs and so forth. And I got interested in that when I was a doctoral student in economics. And if you really want to get bored sometime, I can take you to the professors. And I can pick out the courses. I had some professors that were so boring that when they would talk, chalk dust would fall out of their mouths. It was really bad. And I would look forward to class ending so that I could make a quick stop by the restroom and enjoy reading the graffiti on the walls. At that time, what we had going on were continued stories. How many of you have ever seen a continued story on a bathroom wall? All right. And more than one handwriting, more than one person is involved in telling the story. I see you shaking your head, different color ink, different handwriting, and some very creative writing takes place. And one person has sat there and written a paragraph about the continuing saga, and another person comes in and adds to it. And in a way, I couldn't wait to get in and check out to see how the story was going. But also, I was interested in the other kind of graffiti, a sort of a sudden shift of wit that sometimes we see expressed on the bathroom wall. When I arrived at Clemson as an assistant professor teaching for the first time at the university, I wondered if there were any creative bathroom poets on that campus. And shortly after beginning my first course, which is this incredibly wonderful course called Microeconomic Theory that everybody loves, there on the bathroom wall next to my office, someone had written, "Where will you spend eternity?" Well, I'm in that part of the country where people ask those kinds of questions, and I thought about the question, as I'm sure many people did who passed that way. 2 or 3 days later, when I was in the restroom, someone had answered it. From the way things look in economics, 314. That was my course. You may feel that way before we get done here today. Yeah? That was my course. And so I realized here's a way for someone to send a message to an intended recipient with a high probability that it will be received. After I posted grades for the semester, same handwriting, there over the toilet paper roll, economics diplomas, take one. And so I got more interested in all of this writing, and I was giving a lecture one day, and there was a young man writing away on his desktop as I spoke, and I wondered, how on earth can his mind be diverted from something as fascinating as Cobb-Douglas production functions? And after class, I walked back to see what was written there. And here were these beautiful words from the English poet William Cowper. "There is a garden in her face, where roses and white lilies grow. A heavenly paradise is that place, wherein all pleasant fruit do flow." And I thought to myself, I can't compete with those ideas as people express themselves on desktops. I got a letter from a doctor in North Carolina. He said, "I've heard about your hobby and your collection. Here's something I wanted to contribute for it." It came from a sign in front of a church. Must have been a rather mod church. The sign said, "Tired of sin? Come on in." Someone had written, "If not, call 654-8979. And I got a call one day, and the voice on the other end of the line said, "I've been commissioned to write a magazine article on vanishing American graffiti.
What a turn of phrase. And I understand that you have one of the more interesting collections. I've heard about your collection, and I would like to have some of your better items from my article. I said, wonderful. But let me tell you first, you're talking to a market economist, and we have this idea of gains from trade. That it's possible if someone has something you want, you have something they would like to have. And the two parties can engage in trade so that after the transaction, both parties are made better off than they were before. I said, do you get where I'm coming from? And he says, I think I'm getting the message. And I said, here's the deal, friend. You've been getting some graffiti. For every one you give me, I will give you one of mine. And we traded graffiti over the phone, and I got one of my favorites. It came from Xavier University in Cincinnati. The first person had written on the wall there at the Xavier, suicide is the only truly interesting philosophical question. Pretty heavy, isn't it? Suicide is the only truly interesting philosophical question. A second person came and wrote, suicide is not a question, it's an answer. And a third person came and wrote, an answer to what? And a fourth came and wrote, to be or not to be, that is the question. And a fifth came and wrote, that's not a question, that's a sentence fragment. That must have been an English major. Fortunately, when we talk about regulation, to be or not to be is generally not the way we look at it. At least until you try to change one, particularly a major one. My introduction to this came in 1976-77 when I had the opportunity to become a part of a small organization there. We enjoyed having an identification card that said White House staff. But a small organization of 7 people who were in the Council on Wage and Price Stability, a unit led by Jim Miller, who was to have been your speaker, and a wonderful friend of mine. I had an opportunity to join this small staff for a year on leave from my university, and it was this group that was reviewing newly proposed federal regulations. Tom Leonard, who's back at the table near the door, Tom was there at the time I came in the door, John Morrell and others. Many of you know some of those wonderful people. They were very tolerant of me, and I learned a lot from them as we all worked on regulations. In a sense, this was the root of OIRA. Starting off with 7 people. We had 1 research assistant, 2 secretaries. I should say there were 7 economists in all. There were about 10 people in all. And it was our job to review all newly proposed federal regulations and obviously to pick some and get on to those. And it was as a result of some experiences there that I began to develop what became known as the theory of bootleggers and Baptists. On my beat was Consumer Product Safety Commission, EPA, Federal Trade Commission, and what was then called HEW, HHS today. We each had a beat, and we kept up with rules to some extent with a lot of guidance as to what would be considered major and worthy of our time. I was reviewing a rule for lawnmower standards, a typical kind of technology-based rule that was going to make lawnmowers safer. And there's no doubt about it. There are a lot of injuries associated with rotary lawnmowers. And if any of you love cutting grass the way I do, you know how that can happen. But the CPS proposed regulation was very heavy in terms of engineering standards. It was going to require a dead man's clutch. It was going to require that there be skirting all around the mower and making it not impossible but difficult for someone to get their fingers harmed seriously by fooling around with blades and so forth. It was a very costly regulation. It was probably going to double the price of the typical push lawnmower. It so happened that I was renting my house in Clemson to a man who was president of a lawnmower manufacturing company. And I was home for checking on some things, visiting, and there was a cocktail party to which I had been invited, and I looked up and there's my friend who's renting the house. And I walk over to speak to him, and I said, all I want to hear is good news. Don't tell me about problems with the house. And we chatted for a few minutes, and I said, I wanted to get your thoughts on this lawnmower standard. I knew that he was not among the rationally ignorant, that he would be very informed about these things. He grabbed me by the elbow, Here I have a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, and he has something. He grabs me by the elbow, and he whispers, "Come over here in the corner, Bruce, I'll tell you what I think." And I thought, what on earth is this all about? So we got behind a palm tree, and there I was behind a palm tree, and someone talking about the CPSC proposed standard, and he said, "I'll tell you honestly what I think about that regulation." I knew just what he was going to say. It's insanely costly. I don't know what we're going to do. No, that wasn't what he said. He said, "This is the greatest thing that has ever come down the road for our industry." And I looked at him for a moment, and he said, "It's going to wipe out all of the mom and pop shops in America that get sheet metal bent and put a Briggs & Stratton engine on the sheet metal and a blade, and they're out selling lawnmowers. We will be there when the last roll is called." And then he taught me, economies of scale are very important in meeting regulations and standards, and we're big. Our cost on average will be low, and our competitors' costs will be high. And so there I heard a story that I did not expect to hear, but it got me to thinking. Then when I represented our group at a hearing on fuel economy standards, and this was the first time that fuel economy standards were being set for the U.S. auto fleet, there at the Department of Transportation, I came into the room, the docket had been written, and there were representatives from companies that we have mostly forgotten about, American Motors, for example. Chrysler was there, Ford was there, General Motors, and interestingly enough, a representative from the U.S. Justice Department, and I wondered, why is he here? And then as we talked about the rules that were to be set on an annual basis for fuel economy, it turned out that General Motors was lobbying for stricter rules than had been proposed. They had already downsized their fleet at the time. And American Motors said, "Oh heavens, if you do that, we'll go bankrupt." And somebody said, "Do you want a crying towel?" You know, we're accustomed to hearing people cry and complain about regulations. And Chrysler said, "We'll go bankrupt. There's not enough four-cylinder engine capacity in the world to take care of what would happen." And then there was a discussion about auto emissions. I was doing that one. So there were some of the very early emissions on nitrogen oxide for auto emissions. And as always, we would have interested people who would come in to counsel with us and give us the benefit of their knowledge and experience. And I had one of the big three auto companies representatives there in my little office, and we were talking about these rules, exchanging ideas, and I said, "Look, just for the hell of it, let's just talk for a few minutes. What if the Council on Wage and Price Stability came out in favor of doing away with technology-based standards for emission control of automobiles and went with a performance standard so you could do it any way you wanted to?" He looked at me for a minute. He said, "We would fight you all the way." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We have the most sophisticated laboratories in the industry for dealing with technology-based EPA standards, and if they were done away with, we would have a huge capital loss. It's a piece of specialized capital that has no salvage value. We want to keep the rules." And so out of this came this idea that developed into sort of a everyman's theory that I call the theory of bootleggers and Baptists. And generally speaking, I don't have to elaborate on what that means, but when I was giving a lecture in Paris a few years ago, I did. The Frenchman said, "Baptistes and bootleggers, what are you talking about?" But most of us know that in rural areas of America, historically, there have been two groups that favored laws that shut down the liquor stores on Sunday. The Baptists, who favor a diminution in the consumption of alcoholic beverages. I'm Methodist, and you could call it bootleggers and Methodists, but you would lose the wonderful alliterative content. And the bootleggers, because they love to get rid of competition at least one day a week. And so the bootleggers go to the liquor stores on Saturday in their minivans, and they fill up with booze, and they sell in drinking houses on Sunday at a premium. And the Baptists watch to make certain that the legitimate sellers are closed down. They do the monitoring. And so you have almost zero monitoring costs from the standpoint of government. And then when there is debate or discussion about revising the regulations at state capitals, The bootleggers never show up with signs saying, support your local bootlegger, help me to make a dishonest living. They don't have to. Who shows up? The Baptists show up. And they take the high moral ground, the moral high ground. And so the story goes, the bootleggers pay the sheriff and the politicians to be sympathetic to their cause. And so that's the story. Well, as I dug into this and got more interested in theories of bootleggers and Baptists, my research carried me back to Magna Carta, 1225. There's a section, what is called a chapter, but it's only 6 sentences. There's a chapter in Magna Carta that sets the standard width for all cloth to be sold in the kingdom. 2 ells between the selvages. It turns out that that was the width of the London weaver's looms. And only the London weaver's looms met that standard. Everyone else, the weavers in Bristol and elsewhere, had to break their looms and build new ones. It was a way to raise competitors' costs. When I dug into the history of that section, it was marvelous. The story behind it was sort of couched in terms of consumer protection. The idea was being expressed, look, we have a group of illiterate citizens and they're going to be hoodwinked by cloth sellers. And we have to do something to protect them from these rapacious merchandisers, sellers who go from town to town selling cloth. And so there was the Baptist content. And the bootlegger content was obvious. And as I looked back and looked around, I began to find more and more instances. The New Haven colony, for example, had a standard on dimensions for loaves of bread that could be baked and sold in the colony, which wiped out the home bakers. And again, it was based on we've got to protect the innocent consumer. And so it's not to suggest there are not benefits that might spring from this. My interest was in finding a theory that explains the world in which we live. And what I came upon was the idea that durable regulation will be most durable when it satisfies at least 2 interest groups, broadly speaking. Baptists who are interested in making the world a better place in some kind of moral or ethical sense, and bootleggers who are interested in making more money, and they want the same rule. Now let me give you just a few examples. All of these will be taken from stories in daily newspapers. This is from the Wall Street Journal. A number of years ago, the headline, "Owls of all things helped Weyerhaeuser cash in on timber." The story had to do with the northern spotted owl, which was sort of a protected species as a result of a court order. And so Weyerhaeuser, the story goes on to tell us, Weyerhaeuser hires wildlife biologists who are out roaming through the woods, making the imitated call of northern owls. Hoo, hoo, hoo. I don't know what they say, but the wildlife biologists were making the call, and if they heard an answer, then they could mark the map, and something like a 50-mile radius from the owl's habitat would be shut off limits for cutting. So the story went on about this wonderful timber company hiring wildlife biologists to step up to the bar and protect an endangered species. But it turned out that Weyerhaeuser wasn't on their land. They were on somebody else's land. And as it turns out, Weyerhaeuser says it has restricted logging on 320,000 acres of its own land to comply with the rules. On the other hand, logging restrictions to protect the owl have put more than 5 million acres of federal timberland out of the loggers' reach. The last sentence in the story, owl-driven profits enabled the company to earn $86 million in the first quarter, up 81% from a year earlier. And so who would be in favor of maintaining protection of that marvelous bird, the northern spotted owl, among others? It would be Weyerhaeuser. This is an item that came from the Washington Post. The headline, "Whose Vroom has less fume?" The Environmental Protection Agency intends to adopt a rule to cut emissions from small engines used in leaf blowers, hedge trimmers, so forth. The John Deere Company makes some of these implements. has enlisted the aid of environmentalists and some politicians to convince EPA to set the emission standard higher. Why do they want it higher? You know the answer. They have a technology where they will have no difficulty in meeting it, and it'll be an example of raising competitors' cost. I mentioned in my earlier remarks about cartelizations that come to play through the regulatory process, almost inevitably, though, only where we have technology-based standards. And so a way to reduce the probability of having the cartels form would be to have legislation that calls for a performance standard instead of technology-based standards. Sometimes when I give lectures and lead a discussion, groups like this, somebody in the room will kindly send me a note afterwards. And this one came from someone. It had to do with a piece of legislation pending called the Internet Gambling Prohibition Act. And these were letters, sections from letters that arrived in the congressman's office from which the email came to me. One was from the National Association of Convenience Stores. We strongly support the bill as it will prohibit the at-home purchase of lottery tickets. Well, we represent 2,400 convenience store companies with more than 7,000 outlets. Next letter, the American Gaming Association urges you to support this bill. We're a national trading association that represent the casinos and the manufacturers of gambling machinery. And the other letter was from the Christian Coalition. We support this prohibition. And so we find bootleggers and Baptists everywhere. Now there's one other small item that increases the probability that we will find more of them, and it was mentioned in our earlier session, and it has to do with one sentence in the new executive order that says, values that are difficult or impossible to quantify may be considered, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. Those are things that the Baptists will love, and the bootleggers will coalesce around them. And now I want to close with one last item of graffiti. It came from that source of all great knowledge at Clemson, my little town, the restroom and the train station. And this is my advice to you, as sent to you by the graffiti writer. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. Thanks very much.
Well, while they're coming up, for those of you that are interested, the Council on Wage and Price Stability, on which Bruce served, was a precursor to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. If you go on the Mercatus.org website, you can find every letter written by the Council on Wage and Price Stability. And what you'll see is that things have not changed much in 35 years. The same problems that they were addressing are still with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim now, and you have a chance to ask questions, and we're doing this by card, right?
Yes, that's right, but
He's got them.
I've been provided with them, and assuming that I can always read the handwriting, I'm going to read them off, and then you can go right down the panel. The first one says, you recommend a statutory requirement for regulatory analysis applicable to all agencies, including independent agencies. Does that mean the same standard for every agency?
I bet you better to weigh in on that, Susan.
Yes. The standards are general, and so yes.
I absolutely agree. We have developed these standards over 30 years. There's excellent guidance called Circular A4 on how to do this analysis, and absolutely it should apply to independent agencies, just like the executive branch agencies.
You mentioned that benefit cost analysis is an input for decision making, not the actual decision. But what would prevent the results of benefit cost analysis from being used as the default decision under your review or reform?
Well, I think we need to have a broader understanding of what the results of a benefit cost analysis are. The results are not just, well, here's a benefit figure and here's a cost figure and one is bigger. But I'd like to see agencies explain how their definition of the problem shaped the types of alternatives that they looked at. And to me, that would be a really important use of regulatory analysis that we don't even really touch on when we think of the results as just comparing net benefit or comparing cost with benefit to get net benefits.
Another piece of that consideration, I think, that none of us, I don't think, elaborated on, is that we would like to see a richer analysis of alternative approaches for accomplishing the goals of the rules with benefit cost analysis of the alternatives, and then perhaps to throw something in that the agency offer a justification when it chooses not to adopt what they show to be the most cost beneficial approach. And there may be some good considerations that they would offer, but it does open up the opportunity for dialogue based on something that is structured and fairly solid in terms of a framework of analysis.
I'll just add, analysis is analysis. It's done by analysts.
Yeah.
Analysts aren't decision makers, and as I've always pointed out, they're not paid enough to be decision makers.
Okay. That's a good point.
It's been suggested that agencies do not adequately pay regard to public comments, particularly those that disagree with them. What would you consider to be an adequate response?
I guess I made that suggestion, so I better deal with it. That's why I like the idea of formal rulemaking. I do think that the idea that you actually have to, when somebody comes in and they make a comment, that agencies actually on the record, in public, have to explain why they disagree, actually what the basis for their disagreement is, so they're not able to just easily dismiss and say, well, you didn't provide us enough evidence, so we're not changing our mind. I'd like to see actual cross-examination. I think that's an excellent way to get at the truth of the matter. Anybody else?
You got anything on that?
Okay.
From a state regulatory standpoint, are any of the reforms that have been mentioned today better able to reform state regulatory systems?
I guess my experience with what is going on with state regulatory agencies is they've got a long way to travel. That is, it is not commonplace in states that there will be any kind of structured review of proposed rules and regulations. Years ago, many states had something they called fiscal notes. And fiscal notes were a review of newly proposed rules and regulations where they took into account the fiscal impact of those rules. But I don't think that is done systematically. So I think we may have a great variety out there in the great laboratory of federalism, but I don't think we have much going on here. Anybody else have some ideas on how states are doing? Okay, yeah.
Today's discussion included a lot of information about unintended consequences from regulation. From your research, how do agencies approach the talk of identifying the potential for unintended consequences in regulatory action?
You got one.
Well, I certainly one of the biggest unintended consequences that agencies are not doing, in my mind, a good job about are risk trade-offs. And that's a whole nother subject, but I describe it as whack-a-mole. You know this game, right, where you whack a mole and one goes down, the other pops up? This is virtually always the case in risk regulation. Every time you try to regulate risks one place, something else has to take its place, and when something else takes its place, that has a risk also. This is something that should be done, and particularly in benefit cost analysis, somewhere between benefit cost analysis and risk assessment. It's something that agencies typically don't like to do because, as I said, sometimes it presents them with an increased risk that they'd rather not take account of. So personally, I'd like to see much more emphasis on that.
And some people suggest the unintended consequences really were intended. And depending on how you might elaborate on that, but I would say the risk of having meaningful unintended consequences go up the more specific is the rule and regulation or the statute that is spawning it. Again, beat the same drum. If we have statutes requiring performance standards to achieve the same goal, there's less likelihood of having unintended consequences than having a statute which says best available technology must be defined and assigned and required of every firm in the industry.
I'm at the end of the questions that have been left for us, but I'm glad to come around the room and talk to those of you who have a question to ask. Please identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Bruce Krause. Just a question for Susan, who had suggested flipping the presumption on major rule analysis so that essentially Congress had to ratify a rule. We heard from Senator Warner, that a lot of his constituents were actually begging the Congress to delegate to the agencies, including mine, a lot of the rulemaking under Dodd-Frank, which of course was a response to a serious problem a few years ago, which some of you may remember. If we had your proposal in effect today, it's my estimation that of the 100 rules that we're trying to adopt by the July 22nd deadline, I doubt very many of them would pass the Congress that's now in power. So would you amend your proposal, or are you essentially suggesting that it essentially any regulation has to, that's commanded by one Congress has to pass the muster under a second Congress?
Well, this is not my proposal. It's Jeff Davis, I think, introduced it as H.R. 10 in this Congress, and Senator DeMint and Davis, and I think they have 86 co-sponsors, introduced it in the last Congress. So it's not my proposal. I was just describing it. Yes, their view would be that this Congress would have to vote on each of those regulations. It would be the major regulations, so those that have an effect, positive or negative, of 100 million or more in a year.
Just to provide some context, in looking at regulations in 2008, 2009, there were 45 economically significant regulations that we found in 2008, 42 in 2009, so, and maybe a third to a half of those were related to budgetary programs. So it's an appreciable number, but it's not a ridiculously large number.
And that probably didn't include independent agencies? Would it included SECs?
Right. The count. You're right. The count that I gave was the economically significant ones from the executive branch agencies.
Yeah, I would add, Congress did tend to try to take more account of what the regulations were coming from their laws, and that's why we got the Congressional Review Act. But in all the years since the Congressional Review Act, many of the people in this room know, it's been used once. Congress has actually vetoed one rule, and that was a midnight regulation.
A question for Bruce. Please identify yourself.
It's Mark Nadell. I'm wondering what your view on professional licensing. Many argue that professional licensing is unnecessarily burdensome. A less alternative would be just to require non-licensed practitioners to prominently, clearly disclose they're not licensed. Question what your view is on that, but also the law schools. Would you characterize law schools as the Baptists or the bootleggers on that issue?
I've known some that were Baptists and some that were bootleggers on your last question, but on the first, and I would suggest there's a lot of mischief associated with the licensure activities across states and municipalities. Some go to certification as opposed to licensing and require prominent display of your certification. If you're not certified, in a sense, the consumer is warned, I'm doing business with an uncertified practitioner, as opposed to having a license, which means you can't even engage in this activity without the permit. For instance, in a related way, in Singapore, for consumer products, they have a voluntary certification process for soap and toothpaste and razor blades and so forth. You submit your product to government if you wish to. They test it, and then they randomly check to see if the product meets the government standards. The product with the prominent seal, it's big, competes head-to-head with other products that are not sealed. And the people, when I spoke with them in the government, said, we expect to get a higher price for our product in the marketplace, and if we don't, we're not doing our job. We look to competition to tell us whether we're setting the right criteria. And again, it's sort of like requiring certification instead of a license. So opening up competition for certification is the direction that one might lean. But also, I think, typically you consider the population that is being served by a particular group and whether they are systematically vulnerable and whether certification is going to be the approach most helpful in that case.
Yeah, let's consider one major area has a big effect on all of us, especially in this town, where people routinely practice without a license, and that's economics.
Okay.
On some days,
Okay.
I feel like I could support the idea that folks who practice economics without an advanced degree should be required to disclose that. On the other hand, I'm not sure if it would protect us from much low-quality economics.
I think we have time for one last question.
Mark Powell, USDA. No doubt there are cases where prescriptive standards would disadvantage some firms and advantage others, but I think that the enthusiasm about performance standards should be tempered. Often that simply shifts the problem to a complicated set of guidelines or what have you to demonstrate that you're complying with the performance standard. We see that at USDA where the small businesses are the first to ask for some sort of safe harbor. And it's not unique to USDA. I know, for example, in the risk-based capital standards under the Basel agreements, it's the same thing where the small financial entities want a safe harbor. It is only the most large and complicated financial institutions that have the wherewithal to invest in internal risk models and demonstrating to the bank examiners that they're in compliance with a performance standard.
Right. When I touched on that point, I was reflecting on environmental regulation, which I've done more work on that area than any other area. And it is the one that is endemic with technology-based standards, and within technology-based standards, differential standards for new sources and old sources. And the existing firms love that cartelization aspect of the regulations, and it is typical. But I think your point is well taken. If we shifted to performance standards, it would change the character and structure of regulatory agencies significantly, because then the burden is on the agency to see if performance is taking place. Then you become focused on outcomes as opposed to inputs. Under a technology standard, if the firm is using the prescribed technology and abiding by the blueprint, then they're okay. The river may be dying, but you're in compliance. And so performance-based does focus on keeping score with what it is we're trying to make better. Some of the problems you mentioned would be associated with it also.
We're going to wrap up. Thank you all so much for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed your morning. We're looking at this as just the beginning of a continuing dialogue. I do think the time is right for some of these changes to take place. I hope none of you are going away today thinking, well, what we need to do is go back to the Queen and get back in the empire. That, in fact, we do need to take a hard look at these regulatory institutions and see what needs to be changed to keep us competitive. And so I'd like to thank our speakers today, and thank you all so much for coming. And please be sure to visit our website, Mercatus.org.